So when you start a biotech company that's focused on making therapeutics, you want to have a drug that's approved for an indication, right? You're going to be going and after you complete your preclinical development, which is basically you test whether the drug works in mice, and that it's not too toxic, and that it's not broken down in the plasma the moment you take the pill. Then you have to say like, okay, now we're going to start a clinical trial, and that clinical trial usually has to be for a specific disease. And in the aging space, particularly, we are blessed and cursed with the fact that things in geoscience that extend the lifespan of animals, or target one of the hallmarks of aging and are able to kind of reduce the buildup of or rejuvenate the damage of aging, can often be applied, at least in the animal models, to a ton of different diseases. For example, when we eliminate senescent cells from the body of a mouse, we see muscle regrowth, bones get stronger, rates of cancer go down, lifespan goes up 35% at maximum, hair can regrow, kidney function improves. There's all sorts of things, cardiovascular function. So when you say like, okay, well, what do you now make the primary indication you're going to design your first clinical trials around for a drug derived from this? It can be quite challenging. And so just to use a very concrete example, to continue with the senescent cell space, Unity Biotech, who are putting together small molecules to kill senescent cells, are going after osteoarthritis as one of their first indications. But I think that we all realize that the senescent cell space is intended to eventually be bigger, right? Ideally, we would all be eliminating our senescent cells for all of those things at once, right? Restoring our muscles and bones and whatever else in old age. But we just can't do that in the current regulatory system right yet. Or perhaps even more accurately, we could, but the clinical trial risk of doing so doesn't make sense from an investment perspective, but also from like what exists in the insurance industry and what's going on in doctors' offices right now. We need a little bit more time to validate the geoscience approach to get there. So that's what I mean by primary indication. And then once you have your primary indication, then you say like, okay, we're going to go for this one thing first, and then it's going to branch. And as soon as we get approval for the one thing, and this is an important part to understand, it's an important part to understand that because most clinical trials don't work out, for any given project, the biggest hurdle that you can make is once you show that your drug is safe and effective in human populations, then all of a sudden it becomes very easy to say, okay, well that biology is also relevant to disease B, C, D, E, and F in addition to A, right? And so most investors will say like, instead of advancing A through F to the clinic all at the same time and incurring the same costs throughout those things, it's worth spending a little bit of time to stagger those things, go with A first, and then plan B through F to kind of follow up as soon as there is a validation that A is really going to work. And that way you could actually throw a lot more things at the wall, right? You can try 10 projects instead of one, because you're going to be doing 10 different A's for 10 different projects, as opposed to one project with 10 different indications that you go for right away.
Interesting. You said something about validating the geoscience approach. How does one validate the geoscience approach?
Well, this is not my particular topic of expertise, but this is one I spend a lot of time thinking about. So let's first define the geoscience approach, right? So the geoscience approach is the idea that by altering the fundamental biology of what makes us age and decline, we can prevent the diseases of aging, or at least delay the diseases of aging, making us healthier for longer. And sometimes that means also living longer. And I would say this includes topics such as, metabolic dysfunctions that you correct, such as the rapamycin metformin type studies, but also, altering our senescent cells, messing with our telomeres to make us live longer and healthier, et cetera, et cetera. There are a bunch of different approaches that have been hypothesized or already shown in animal models. By validating the geroscience hypothesis, I mean that we haven't yet shown in humans that we can take a single therapeutic agent, give it to a person, and have that person be protected from multiple diseases of aging, or cured of multiple diseases of aging. But I think that that's even a further stretch. Let's even just say preventive. Once that happens, this regulatory structure that we've been talking about, it changes substantially. Because once you can approve medicines for the prevention of multiple diseases at one time, then the game becomes very different. And you don't have to look for your one little thing that you start with and then go branching out to other things. And so this is why, and I know on geroscience you've covered the TAME trial before. This is why I'm such a big advocate of the TAME trial and similar other trials for NAD boosters and other types of geroprotectors in human studies, because I think that even a small success, right, like a regulatory approval that shows that metformin, which is obviously not a great life-extending medicine, but does have a serious effect, right? In mouse studies, you're talking about 5 to 10%. If that has an effect in humans, which could justify insurance companies paying for metformin for people at a high risk of developing an age-related disease, it completely changes the game for people doing senescent cell research or telomere research or stem cell research who want to rejuvenate the body. Because all of a sudden you have not just a precedent of FDA approval, but you will also get out of that biomarkers and ways of making the clinical trials go faster that you can use in future trials. And so that validation of the geroscience hypothesis, I think, will actually be a watershed moment in the history of medicine in the 21st century. Whether it's the TAME trial or NAD or any of a number of other compounds.
Circling back around to primary indications, are there any in particular that are better or worse?
So one of the things that we specialize in at Apollo, and one of the things that I find really, really, really fascinating, is that geroprotectors, or let's say therapeutics that interfere with lifespan in animal models, we usually know which molecular targets they're going after. And so let's just use a very basic example, which is rapamycin goes after the mTOR protein complex, right? Mm-hmm. And the mTOR protein complex is certainly involved in aging, because when you inhibit mTOR, and specifically mTOR1, lifespan of mice goes up. And it seems like that's probably going to be true in dogs and may even be true in people. We'll see. And rapamycin is one decent tool for that, but a number of groups, including us, are working on other tools for interfering with mTOR as well. But we don't want to start with treating all diseases at one time in a TAME trial with mTOR. And so what we look for when we think about the primary indication for these things are specific diseases that have a very high unmet need. And when that unmet need is really, really high, then we can launch the drug targeting often a rare population of patients that really have a problem there. So when we look at the mTOR space, for example, there are a number of diseases in which mTOR is chronically overactive. And this can be genetic diseases, genetic diseases, acquired conditions, but they're often like very serious conditions that have high fatality rates and very few existing treatments. And then we would think about launching a drug for those things first, testing our compound in those conditions first, and then if it works, to our earlier conversation, if it works in that little piece, if it's effective and safe in patients, then we expand it out to a broader range of people in whatever way makes sense as quickly as we can do it. So the short answer is that we don't look for a specific indication, and there isn't one that I think is like the aging stepping stone indication. If we wanted to think of those there, you'd look at like sarcopenia, osteoarthritis, some of these things that are very associated with aging decline. But I think actually the more promising route is to go after the genetic disease, rare condition, things with a very high unmet need as a first stepping stone. That will depend enormously on what the science underlying each individual therapeutic is.
How are progeric diseases as primary indications?
So progerias are very interesting scientific cases. And we have actually talked with some groups that are working on treatments for progerias. The first thing to mention there is that different progerias are molecularly very, very, very different from each other. And secondly, one of the issues with many genetic diseases, including progerias, is that a lot of what occurs in progerias is has already happened by the time you start the drug. So unless you can be highly rejuvenative, it's often not enough. Like you might be able to help the situation and maybe ameliorate some of the existing decline, but usually with progerias, their problems begin so early on that unless you can come with a truly rejuvenative approach, it's not going to have the sort of impact that I would want to have in going with a patient or in treating a patient. So we've looked at we have talked to a number of researchers working on this space, and I think that there are some pieces of work that we've looked at that could truly make a difference in the lives of people with progeria. But because of the very, very severe nature of most of these progeria conditions, I think that it is a very tough one to develop really meaningful compounds for. So it's a specific and tough question that you asked, but I think that's the best answer that I can give at this stage.
Are most of the therapies that you encounter preventative and not rejuvenative?
No. Most of the therapies that we encounter have the capacity to do both, but are specifically rejuvenative while broadly preventative. So, for example, with senescent cells, let's say, as an example we can come back to, or rapamycin, but let's use senescent cells. With senescent cells, there are a number of conditions that we think the pathology is really driven by senescent cells, right? Let's take sarcopenia as an example. If you can get rid of senescent cells, and then acutely that will restore the muscles of aging mice. There is also the chance that, if you take a mouse that's already very sick and very aged, and then you get rid of its senescent cells, and to be fair, this hasn't been shown in academic mouse data completely yet, but you can't immediately just restore a nearly dead mouse to health. And this has been true for, no matter what treatment that we see in the geroprotection space. So that you can intervene late and reset somewhat or pause somewhat. But once things go very bad, then at some point there's no coming back, even if you're specifically rejuvenative on some topics. However, that same treatment can be broadly preventative in that if you interact early enough, it can prevent the mouse in this case from entering a downward spiral that leads to the ultimate levels of pathology that are no longer sustained by senescent cells. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's usually what we see. And I think that the geroscience space, at least in the early days, is going to be defined by these dual acting compounds, things that could be first used against specific pathologies, but then pulled back to be used as broad preventatives. And then as the field develops, I think that it will go in two directions. One, doubling down on specific methodologies or specific mechanisms that will then have to be used in combination with each other in order to make a broad effect on the disease. And then simultaneously, there may also be specific things that are not rejuvenative in and of themselves, but once our geroscience hypothesis is proven in the clinical setting, then those compounds could be the next generation of things following your metformin or rapamycin analogs or whatever it is, that can be used to prevent diseases, but they're specifically designed to prevent diseases, not to go after existing indications.